Hello, a short tutorial on Blender to start with basic manipulations in the viewport and object manipulations. In the 3D viewport that is here, we will rotate our camera in several ways. We will move it around the object with a middle click. And this is also something you can do with this tool here. If you click in the gray, you have the option to rotate around the object. The second manipulation will be the pan, so that's going to be a shift middle click simultaneously. I move my mouse while holding down the shift and the middle click, accessible here in the form of this small icon. Hold down the left click to do the pan. The third operation in the viewport will be the zoom. We have the scroll wheel simply by scrolling the wheel, and we can also have something more precise with the control click of the wheel. We can zoom much more precisely on the object accessible here. If we hold down the left click, we have access to this extremely precise zoom. The life-saving technique here is when you lose your object, if it is far away, or in any case, if you can no longer see anything in your scene. The dot on the numeric keypad allows you to instantly resume on your selection. That is to say, if you have nothing selected, no matter how much I press the dot on the numeric keypad, nothing happens. You need to have at least one object selected. I can do that by clicking here, for example. If I press the cube, it is now selected. If I go back over my 3D viewport and press the decimal point on the numeric keypad, I zoom in on the cube. Or if nothing is selected, once again, what you can imagine doing is pressing A. A is the shortcut to select all the objects in the scene, and by doing so, you necessarily create a selection. So if I press A, you'll see that all the objects here will be selected. There you go. And now, if I press on the numeric keypad, I'm not zooming in on the cube anymore, but on my selection, I press the decimal point on the numeric keypad. That's for the manipulations in the viewport. Note also that if you don't have a numeric keypad, it's something you can activate from the menu here. View, you have the frame selected, which allows you to zoom in the same way as when you press the decimal point on the numeric keypad. So once you are somewhat comfortable with navigation in the viewport, the idea is to manipulate objects or even cheat, really, the points of the objects. And so to do this by default on Blender, we will use shortcuts. It's G, the shortcut. So I press G once I release from now on. Now my object is manipulable. I can move it in space, except that I don't know exactly on which axis I'm manipulating it. And actually, here in 3D, whether on Blender or another software, most likely you want to manipulate your object on just one axis or at most two axes, rarely on all three axes at the same time. So to ensure I control the axis on which I move my object, well, when I press G, I release. I can now press, for example, Y for the Y axis and release, and now my object is constrained to the Y axis. It is possible to change the axis on the go. That is, I position myself here. I haven't clicked yet, I haven't confirmed yet. If I now press the X key and release, I am now constrained on the X axis and similarly on the Z axis. This is something you can also do by using the small tools that appear on the left of the 3D viewport, which you can call with T. That's the shortcut, and so you have the move. The move allows you to do the same thing, that is, move on a single axis with a click on the desired axis. So we see when I hover over from the axis, for example, Y, it's more visible on the Y axis. There's a slight color change that means I'm on the Y axis. Now if I left click and hold my left click, my object only moves on the Y axis in the same way on the X axis and similarly on the Z axis. No matter how I move the mouse, it is also possible to do it on two axes at the same time. You just have to position yourself on the small square. And from there, whatever my mouse movement, I only move the cube on the Z and X axis here by coming to position it on this small square. On the Z and Y axis here by putting myself on this square there, and X and Y on this square here. Whatever my mouse movement, I will never go to the top. My object remains still perfectly. To get the same result, that is to say two axes with the shortcuts, it will be G-Shift-Z to move my cube only on the axis X and Y. So Shift plus the axis, it cancels the axis in question, for example. Here if I want to do only on Z and X, I will do G, I release Shift-Y, I release, and now my object forced on the Z and X axis exclusively. The Y axis is no longer active. Then I have the rotations on Blender. The rotations, the shortcut is R. R allows you to rotate the object on all axes at the same time. So of course we will want to control the rotation axis, and to do that we will press R, release, and X to control the rotation and the constraint on the X or Z axis. This is something that is accessible in the toolbar. Same, you position yourself above the axis you want to use, for example here the Y axis, and from there, whatever my mouse movement is, it is on the Y axis that it will turn, here on the X axis and here on the Z axis. And it is of course possible to do with this tool on the 3 axes. On the other hand, on 2 axes, the rotations, it doesn't make sense. So it's either all the axes at the same time or a single axis. So the shortcut on Blender to do the scale is S, I release, and Y to force a scale on the Y axis. It is possible to do it on 2 axes, same as for the movement S, Shift, Z, S, Shift, X, etc. And the tool is therefore accessible in the toolbar. Here it is the scale, which allows you to make a scale on the desired axis on 2 axes at the same time. Always same principle, and the scale is the only tool where it really makes sense most of the time to do it on all 3 axes at the same time. We want to increase or decrease the scale of an object in its entirety. It is therefore possible to do it by clicking on the white circle around the object. These manipulations are of course accessible in edit mode. So there, by default, we are on the object mode. I select the objects of my scene, and I can, if I position myself on the cube, go to edit mode and therefore have access to the different points of my object, and these points I will be able to move them with the same shortcuts. The toolbar has changed because there are now the tools that are used when we are in edit mode. So there are a lot more tools at once, but the movement tools are still there. So I can move my points in the same way that I do it directly with the objects. Here at the level of the points, I can constrain the movement of points on the selected axes, and in the same way with the shortcuts G, X, Y, or Z, G, Shift, Z, etc. It is valid, of course, for rotations, except that rotations on a single point, it doesn't make much sense. It will make sense as soon as we have selected 2 points, plus, of course. And the scales, it's the same. On 1 point it has no use. On the other hand, when we have selected 2 points, we can imagine, modify the object using the scale tool. That's it for this little introduction. See you soon in another little tutorial on Blender.